The moment that forever alters the trajectory of your existence rarely announces itself with the dramatic fanfare movies have conditioned us to expect. There is no swelling orchestral score, no slow-motion sequence to signal that everything you've known is about to crumble beneath your feet. For me, that life-shattering instant came wrapped in the sickly sweet chemical scent of industrial bathroom cleaner, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like mechanical insects, and the devastating echo of words so cruel they seemed to physically ricochet off the imported Italian marble tiles before piercing my heart. "You're nothing." 3 syllables, 2 words, 1 moment. That's all it took to shatter the fragile glass house of my existence and ultimately forge something unbreakable from its jagged remains. But I'm getting ahead of myself, allowing the end to bleed into the beginning. Isn't that what we always do when recounting our deepest traumas? We rush to the resolution, desperate to assure ourselves and others that the pain served some greater purpose, that the humiliation wasn't meaningless, that the darkness eventually gave way to light. Let me take you back to where it truly began, on my raw, aching knees in a place of opulence and excess, where the wealthy have perfected the art of looking through people like me as if we're made of nothing more substantial than air. A place where the privileged practice the deliberate blindness that allows them to believe they've earned every comfort while we've somehow earned every hardship. A temple to inequality disguised as a temple to fine dining, where even the bathrooms are designed to remind some of us that we exist solely to clean up after others. The sound of my brush scrubbing porcelain was almost meditative. 3 strokes left, 2 strokes right, repeat. After 8 hours on my feet, my back screamed in protest as I leaned into the toilet bowl, but I'd learned to ignore the pain months ago. Pain was a luxury I couldn't afford to acknowledge, not when rent was due in 5 days and my bank account held barely enough to cover half. "Just 2 more hours," I whispered to myself, the words dissolving into the steady hum of the restaurant's ventilation system. "2 more hours, and you can go home." Chez Pierre wasn't just a restaurant, it was a temple to excess where people paid more for a single meal than I earned in 3 days. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, casting a warm glow over hand-painted murals and imported Italian marble. The bathroom I cleaned wasn't just a bathroom, it was an experience with its gold-plated fixtures, fresh orchids, and designer hand soaps that cost $50 a bottle. I'd been cleaning these bathrooms for exactly 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, counting each day like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. Long enough to perfect my invisibility, to become nothing more than a pair of hands that magically sanitize surfaces when no one was looking. Long enough to learn the unspoken hierarchy of service work, the bartenders at the top with their charismatic smiles and generous tips, the wait staff next with their choreographed deference that occasionally earned them a wealthy patron's momentary acknowledgement, the kitchen staff hidden behind swinging doors, and then, at the very bottom, people like Methe bathroom attendants, the invisible ghosts who dealt with the most intimate waste of strangers while earning the bare minimum wage, plus the occasional forgotten dollar bill left by a guilty customer who accidentally made eye contact at the precise moment when my humanity became impossible to deny. Those fleeting instances of recognition were almost worse than the invisibility, the awkward smile, the hastily dropped coin or bill, the palpable relief as they escaped back to a world where people like me existed only to serve. The ladies' room door swung open, bringing with it a burst of muted jazz from the dining room and the tinkling laughter of a woman who'd never worried about keeping the lights on. I kept my head down, focusing on the grout between the floor tiles as I'd been instructed during my training. No one wants to be reminded that someone cleans the toilets they use. Mr. Devereaux, the manager, had explained with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Be thorough, be silent, be invisible. I had mastered the art of invisibility long before my employment at Chez Pierre. It was a survival skill inherited through generations of women who learned to navigate a world designed to overlook them. Growing up as the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 soul-crushing jobs had taught me early that some people move through the world perpetually unseen, our existences acknowledged only when our absence would inconvenience others. We were the silent, shadowy background characters in the grand narratives of the privileged, necessary but deliberately unacknowledged. Like the foundation of a magnificent cathedral that tourists admire without ever thinking about the nameless laborers who laid each stone, or the janitors who still sweep its floors centuries later. My mother, Elena Vasquez, had been beautiful once I'd seen it in the faded photographs she kept in a shoebox beneath her bed. A young woman with fiery eyes and a defiant smile, before life and poverty had worn her down to sharp angles and perpetual exhaustion. "Keep your head down, but your eyes open," she would tell me as she braided my hair each morning before school, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency even as fatigue made her words slur slightly. "They don't see us, Rosa, but we see everything about them. That's our advantage." I didn't understand what advantage there could possibly be in invisibility back then. I only knew the shame of secondhand clothes and free school lunches, of teachers who spoke slower and louder to me despite the fact that I'd been born in this country just like my classmates, of birthday parties I was never invited to, and play dates that never materialized. I knew the heavy responsibility of coming home to an empty apartment at age 9, heating up whatever mom had left in the fridge, completing homework alone, and being in bed by the time she dragged herself home from her night shift smelling of hospital disinfectant and other people's needs. "Oh!" The woman's exclamation of surprise was followed by an annoyed sigh. I glanced up reflexively and immediately regretted it. She stood in the doorway, a vision in a crimson dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant twist, diamonds glittering at her ears and throat. But it was her companion who caught my attention, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a tailored suit that screamed old money. His hand rested possessively on the small of her back, guiding her into the bathroom ahead of him. They weren't supposed to be in here together. The men's room was across the hall, but I knew better than to point this out. Rules were for people like me, not for people like them. "I'm sorry," I murmured, gathering my cleaning supplies with practiced efficiency. "I'll come back later." The woman's eyes barely registered my existence as she turned to the man, her perfectly painted lips curving into a smile that transformed her face from merely beautiful to breathtaking. "Richard, darling, we really shouldn't," she giggled, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper as she pulled him further into the bathroom by his silk tie. I recognized that tie, Hermes, latest collection, 180. I knew because I'd seen it in a magazine I'd flipped through during my lunch break 2 days ago, sitting on a bench outside because employees weren't allowed to eat in the restaurant's dining area. The man, Richard, laughed, a deep, confident sound of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. "Come on, Victoria, where's your sense of adventure?" His eyes suddenly caught mine in the large mirror that dominated the wall above the sink. For a fleeting moment, something passed between us, not desire or even acknowledgement, but something more primal. Recognition, perhaps. The uncomfortable awareness of one human being forced to see another. Victoria followed his gaze, her expression shifting from playful seduction to irritation as she registered my continued presence. "Can't you come back later?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. I nodded, keeping my eyes downcast. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm just finishing up." I focused on my hands, encased in yellow rubber gloves stained with bleach and other chemicals that had long since stripped my skin of its natural oils. My nails were short, practical, the skin around them red and cracked despite the thick lotion I applied every night. Her handbag caught my attention as I gathered my supplies, not because I was particularly interested in designer accessories, but because its presence in my mundane reality was so jarring, it demanded acknowledgement. A limited edition Hermes Birkin in a shade of blue so vibrant it seemed almost alive, the color of tropical waters I'd only seen in travel magazines I flipped through during lunch breaks. The leather so supple it appeared to breathe with its own rhythm, the hardware gleaming with the warm glow of real gold, not the plated imitation that adorned less exclusive items. I knew that bag, not from personal experience, what a laughable thought, but from the countless hours I'd spent in the public library's free internet access, educating myself about a world I could observe but never inhabit. $30 minimum for the basic version, but this particular limited edition would fetch closer to $75 at auction. With a waiting list years long that celebrities and royalty languished on despite their status, the price of a college education, a down payment on a modest home, 3 years of medical treatment that might have saved my mother's life, all carried casually on one privileged arm, probably one accessory among dozens in her climate-controlled closet, likely to be replaced next season when fashion dictated a new must-have item. Richard's gaze lingered on me a moment too long, his expression not lecherous but curious, as if he were trying to place my face. I'd never seen him before, I would have remembered, but something in his scrutiny made me uncomfortable, like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. Victoria noticed, of course she did. Women like her are trained from birth to detect the slightest shifts in attention, to monitor the gaze of those they consider their property. The playful, seductive atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by something cold and dangerous that seemed to lower the temperature in the room by several degrees. Her perfectly lined lips, painted the exact shade of crimson as her dress, curled into a sneer that transformed her beautiful face into something almost reptilian. With deliberate, calculated precision, she stepped between us, using her body as a physical barrier to block his view of Mia territorial gesture as ancient as civilization itself. Then she did something I wasn't prepared for, something that crossed the invisible boundary that usually separates the privileged from those who serve them. She placed her manicured hand, adorned with a diamond engagement ring that could have paid off all my student loans, directly on my shoulder. The contact was shocking, not just the unexpected violation of my personal space, but the weight behind it as she physically pushed me aside with enough force that I had to catch myself against the sink to avoid stumbling. "You shouldn't be seen around people like us," she said, her voice pitched loud enough that it echoed against the marble walls, ensuring there could be no pretense that her words were meant for private ears. Her perfect white teeth flashed behind blood-red lips as she continued, "Some people are meant to stay invisible. Know your place." The casual cruelty of the moment stunned me into silence, the violence of her words like a physical blow that knocked the air from my lungs. I'd been insulted before, degraded before, ignored and overlooked, and treated as something less than human, but always with the thin veneer of plausible deniability that allowed the wealthy to sleep at night, the careful euphemisms and coded language that preserved the fiction of American egalitarianism. This was differentia, intentional, a deliberate reminder of my supposed inferiority stripped of all pretense. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the absolute conviction behind them. The bone-deep certainty that she was simply stating an obvious natural law, like gravity or thermodynamics. Some people were born to be seen, valued, catered to. Others were born to be invisible, to serve, to clean up the messes left behind. Richard shifted uncomfortably behind her, his expression clouding, but he said nothing. His silence was its own form of violence. I nodded, mumbled, "Sorry," and pushed my cart toward the door, blinking rapidly to keep the tears at bay. As I left, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror-tired eyes in a forgettable face, the dull gray uniform hanging loosely on my frame, my brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The perfect picture of insignificance. The service corridor was mercifully empty as I leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to steady myself. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving compared to the warm glow of the dining room. Two worlds separated by a single door roan bathed in luxury, the other stark in its utilitarian purpose. "Rosa, you okay?" I straightened up immediately at the sound of Marco's voice. The dishwasher had been at Chez Pierre for nearly a decade, his dark skin weathered and hands permanently pruned from constant immersion in water. His kindness was one of the few genuine things in this place. "I'm fine," I lied, pushing my cart toward the supply closet. "Just tired." Marco's eyes, wise beyond his 45 years, saw right through me. "Those people, they got no respect," he said, shaking his head. "My abuela always said, the truly wealthy need not remind others they are poor." I managed a weak smile. Your abuela sounds wise. The wisest, he agreed, hefting a stack of plates. Don't let them get to you, Rosa. One day, they might need you more than you need them. His words were meant as comfort, a harmless fantasy to ease the sting of humiliation. Neither of us could have known how prophetic they would prove to be. By the time my shift finally staggered to its conclusion at 10 p.m., exhaustion had settled into my bones like an old friend who had overstayed their welcome, familiar yet increasingly unbearable. 9 hours and 43 minutes on my feet. We were never paid for the mandatory pre-shift meeting where management reminded us daily of our inadequacy as scrubbing, polishing, disinfecting, and enduring the countless indignities, both large and small, that came with being a bathroom attendant at an establishment where a single appetizer cost more than I earned in an hour. My lower back spasmed with a white-hot pain that radiated down my left leg, the result of bending hundreds of times to reach surfaces designed without consideration for the humans who would clean them. My hands burned beneath the thin rubber gloves that never quite protected against the industrial-strength chemicals that stripped grease and dirt as efficiently as they stripped away layers of my skin. Red, cracked patches had formed between my fingers where moisture had seeped in during my shift, creating the perfect environment for the painful eczema that no amount of dollar store cortisone cream seemed to soothe. My feet had progressed beyond mere throbbing to a numb, pulsating agony confined within cheap, non-slip shoes purchased from Walmart that had long since surrendered their minimal cushioning to the relentless pressure of supporting my body weight on unforgiving tile floors. A dull headache pressed against my temples from the combination of harsh cleaning fumes, fluorescent lighting, and the effort of containing emotions that threatened to overflow at any moment. But beneath the physical discomfort lay something more insidious, a weariness of spirit that Victoria's words had only deepened. How long could a person remain invisible before they began to disappear even to themselves? The night air felt like a blessing against my skin as I stepped out of the restaurant's back entrance, inhaling deeply to clear the chemical smell from my lungs. The employee exit opened onto a narrow alley, a stark contrast to the grand facade that welcomed guests at the front. Even the building itself reinforced the hierarchy: beauty and comfort for those who could afford it, utility and afterthought for those who served. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and I hurried toward it, checking my watch nervously. Miss the 10, 15, and I'd have to wait another 40 minutes for the next one. Another 40 minutes before I could crawl into bed beside Daniel, before I could wash away the day in our tiny shower with its temperamental water pressure. Daniel and I had been together for 3 years. Since we'd met at the community college where I'd been taking night classes in business administration classes I'd had to abandon when Mom got sick and the medical bills started piling up. He wasn't perfect. His ambitions often outpaced his follow-through, and his temper could flare unexpectedly, but he was mine. In a world where I felt increasingly invisible, Daniel saw me, or at least a version of me that I wanted to believe was real. Our apartment was small and bedroom, a bathroom with a perpetually dripping faucet, and a combined living room, kitchen where the refrigerator hummed so loudly we had to raise our voices to talk over dinner. But it was ours. At least, I thought it was ours. I made it to the bus with 2 minutes to spare, collapsing into a seat near the back, away from the handful of other late-night riders. As the city lights slid past the window, I let my mind wander to the weekend ahead. Daniel had promised we'd do something special for our anniversary, nothing fancy, but maybe dinner at that Mexican place we liked, where the plates came piled high with food that tasted like comfort and the margaritas were strong enough to make me forget for a few hours the weight of existing paycheck to paycheck. The bus lurched to a stop 6 blocks from our apartment building. Not close, but close enough. I stepped off onto the cracked sidewalk, pulling my jacket tighter against the evening chill. Our neighborhood wasn't dangerous exactly, but it wasn't the kind of place you lingered after dark. Broken streetlights created pools of shadow between the buildings, and the occasional siren in the distance served as a reminder that safety, like comfort, was a privilege unevenly distributed. The walk to our building always felt longer after a shift at Ches Pierre, as if the physical distance between those two worlds stretched with each step. 5 blocks, 4, 3, the familiar landmarks of my modest life came into view. The convenience store where I sometimes splurged on a pint of ice cream after a particularly hard day. The laundromat with the broken vending machine that had eaten my quarters more times than I could count. The tiny park where neighborhood kids played on equipment that should have been replaced years ago. Our building was unremarkable, a 4-story brick structure with fire escapes zigzagging up the facade like metal veins. The lobby, if you could call it that, smelled perpetually of stale cigarettes and the mysterious cooking spices that seeped from under Mrs. Patel's door on the first floor. The elevator had been out of order for as long as I'd lived there, meaning a 3-flight climb to our apartment, a final indignity at the end of a day spent on my feet. By the 3rd floor, my calves burned in protest, but the prospect of home, of kicking off my shoes and peeling away the uniform that marked me as servant rather than served, propelled me forward. The hallway was quiet, most of our neighbors either asleep or working night shifts of their own. 3 doors down, apartment 3 Chome. I slid the key into the lock, anticipating the familiar resistance before it caught. The door swung open and I stepped into darkness, fumbling for the light switch. Strange Daniel usually left the small lamp on when he knew I was working late. For a moment, I wondered if he'd gone out, maybe picked up an extra shift at the warehouse where he worked loading trucks. The sound hit me first when I flicked on the light switch, primal, rhythmic, undeniable. Moaning, distinct and unmistakable, the soundtrack to humanity's most intimate act filtering through our thin apartment walls. For an eternal moment, I stood frozen in the entryway, keys still clutched in my trembling hand, my exhausted brain desperately attempting to reject what my ears were telling me with absolute clarity. The high-pitched feminine gasps, punctuated by deeper masculine groans, created a duet I knew too well, but from the wrong side of the bedroom door. Surely not. My mind raced through increasingly implausible alternatives. Perhaps Daniel was watching pornography at an inconsiderate volume. Perhaps our upstairs neighbors had finally consummated their obvious attraction, and the building's poor soundproofing was to blame. Perhaps I was hallucinating from exhaustion. My fragile psyche manufacturing the very thing I feared most as some twisted form of self-sabotage. Not Daniel. Not my Daniel, who had whispered forever against my skin countless times, who had held me through the dark days after my mother's death, when breathing itself seemed an insurmountable effort. Not tonight, with our anniversary just 2 days away, the cheap but heartfelt card already purchased and hidden in my work locker, the modest celebration planned with such care around our limited budget. Not in our home, the one sanctuary in a hostile world, the sacred space where, for a few precious hours each day, I was supposed to be more than invisible. I moved through the apartment with the silent practice steps that had become second nature during years of service work instinctively, as if I were still at Ches Pierre. Still the woman who cleaned around wealthy patrons without disturbing their illusion that messes magically disappeared of their own accord. My breathing slowed to shallow, silent draws of air, my body hugging the wall as if I could melt into it completely, becoming the ghost I had been trained to be. The living room was exactly as I'd left it that morning, dishes from breakfast still in the sink where I'd placed them, promising myself I'd wash them when I got home, despite knowing my arms would be too tired to lift even one more plate. The battered couch we'd rescued from a sidewalk 3 blocks away, its mysterious stains hidden beneath the colorful throw blanket my mother had crocheted during her chemotherapy sessions, sat vacant with its mismatched pillows bearing the indentation of where Daniel must have been sitting earlier. The remote control was placed with uncharacteristic precision on the coffee table, the only surface in the apartment that Daniel ever bothered to keep tidy. A quirk I'd once found endearing in its contradiction to his otherwise chaotic approach to housekeeping. Now, that perfectly centered remote seemed ominous, deliberate, like evidence carefully arranged at a crime scene. The bedroom door was partially open, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Through the crack, I could see two bodies moving on our boudoir bed with the blue comforter I'd bought on clearance last winter. The comforter we'd made love on just that morning, Daniel's hands gentle as they traced the curve of my spine, his lips promising forever against my neck. Daniel's broad back was to me. The spine I had traced with gentle fingers countless times now arched away from me in the service of another's pleasure. His body moved in a rhythm I knew intimately. The cadence of his desire, burned into my muscle memory through 3 years of shared night set, suddenly rendered alien and obscene in this devastating new context. The small birthmark on his left shoulder blade, that I'd playfully claimed resembled the state of Texas, was visible in the dim light, a familiar landmark in a geography that no longer belonged to me. I could have closed the door in that moment, could have backed away, could have granted myself the temporary mercy of deniability, and confronted him later when the visual evidence wasn't seared into my consciousness. But something, pride perhaps, or a deeper instinct for self-preservation, or simply the perverse need to witness the full extent of my own destruction, kept me rooted in place. Eyes fixed on the betrayal unfolding before me in our bed, on sheets I had washed just yesterday, beneath the ceiling where tiny plastic stars we'd glued together still glowed with their artificial constellations. The woman beneath him arched upward in a moment of manufactured ecstasy, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her face coming fully into view as she tossed her head back against my pillow. In that instant, the floor seemed to dematerialize beneath my feet, gravity itself betraying me as my world collapsed into a singularity of pain so acute it transcended the physical. I would have recognized Jennifer anywhere, under any circumstances, her features as familiar to me as my own reflection. My best friend since freshman year of high school, when she'd defended me against the cruel taunts of popular girls who mocked my secondhand clothes and accented English. Jennifer, with her distinctive copper-red hair now spread across my pillowcase like spilled wine, the exact shade she maintained with expensive salon treatments she could afford thanks to her parents' generous allowance that continued well into her 20s. The person who'd held my hand with seemingly genuine compassion at my mother's funeral 2 years ago, who'd whispered with tears in her eyes that matched my own, "You're not alone, Rosa. You'll never be alone as long as I'm here. We're sisters in every way that matters." The person who'd recommended me for the job at Chez Pierre through her cousin in management, who'd helped me carry boxes up 3 flights of stairs into this very apartment, who knew every secret hope and private fear I'd ever voiced aloud during countless late-night confidences fueled by cheap wine and the desperate human need for connection. I don't know how long I stood there, a ghost witnessing my own funeral, watching my life disintegrate in excruciating real time. Seconds stretched into eternities as my brain struggled to process the irreconcilable images before me, attempting to force the pieces of this new reality into a pattern that made sense. Long enough for the initial shock to calcify into something colder and harder in my chest. Long enough for Jennifer to open her eyes mid-performance, perhaps sensing the weight of my gaze or experiencing that primal instinct that tells prey they're being watched for her gaze to lock with mine over Daniel's oblivious, rhythmically moving shoulder. I witnessed the moment recognition dawned across her features in a series of micro-expressions that I would replay in nightmares for months afterward. First, the widening of her eyes in shock, pupils dilating with the surge of adrenaline. Then the crimson flush of guilt spreading across her cheeks and chest, followed by the subtle narrowing of her gaze into something calculating. And finally, worst of all, the softening around her mouth into an expression I recognized with sickening clarity as pity, as if I were the pathetic one in this tableau, as if my pain were an inconvenience to her pleasure. She didn't cry out in surprise or shame, didn't gasp or push Daniel away, didn't alert him to my presence with even the slightest change in her breathing. Our eyes remained locked in a silent communication more honest than any we'd shared in 15 years of friendship. I watched as she made her choice with full awareness of my witnessing it. She deliberately closed her eyes again, turning her face away from me into the crook of Daniel's neck. her hands sliding down his back to pull him deeper, closer, her legs wrapping around him more tightly as if to shield herself from the judgment in my stare. To physically anchor him to her in case he sensed my presence. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd shouted it. You don't matter enough for me to stop. This pleasure is worth more than your pain. Your witnessing changes nothing. I backed away silently, my body operating on autopilot while my mind struggled to process what I'd seen. In the living room, evidence of their betrayal was suddenly everywhere. Jen's earrings on the coffee table, the wine glasses in the sink that I'd assumed were left over from a previous night, a woman's jacket tossed casually over the back of a chair, my chair, in my home. I didn't make a scene, didn't collapse into hysterical screams or violent recriminations. Didn't throw things or slam doors or unleash the hurricane of rage and devastation that swirled within me like the people do in movies, those fictional characters with their cathartic confrontations and dramatic exits. What would be the point of such theatrics? To whom would I be performing this display of wounded dignity? For what audience would I be proving my worth? The two people who should have valued me most, who had claimed to love me most, had already rendered their verdict with absolute clarity. I was expendable, replaceable, disposable, invisible even in what should have been my own sanctuary. Instead, I retreated silently from the bedroom doorway, closing the door with exquisite care to avoid detection, my body operating on some reptilian survival instinct that bypassed conscious thought. I moved methodically through the apartment that no longer felt like home, gathering essentials with the practiced efficiency of someone who had always known, on some level, that security was an illusion crafted by privilege, that everything could be taken from you in an instant, that the foundation you believed so solid could disintegrate beneath your feet without warning. My hands performed their duties with mechanical precision while my mind remained suspended in a protective numbness. Clothes went into the duffel bag I kept in the hall, close to habit from childhood, when my mother and I had sometimes needed to leave apartments in the middle of the night when rent money ran out. I selected enough garments for a few days, practical items chosen for utility rather than sentiment or beauty. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, underwear, socks, a sweater for layering. No dresses or heels or decorative scarves that Jennifer had convinced me to buy to brighten your wardrobe, Rosa. Nothing that reminded me of Daniel's touch or approval. I gathered my toiletries from the bathroom, the generic drugstore brands lined up beside Daniel's more expensive grooming products and Jennifer's forgotten luxury cosmetics from her frequent overnight girls. Nights that now took on a sinister new meaning. I took my prescription for allergy medication that cost a day's wages even with insurance, my phone charger with its fraying cord I'd wrapped with electrical tape to extend its life. The single tube of lipstick I allowed myself as an occasional indulgence. From the dresser, I carefully lifted the framed photograph of my mother, the only one where she looked truly happy, taken at a rare family picnic before my father left, her smile radiant and unburdened, frozen in time before cancer hollowed her out like a carved pumpkin, before her eyes took on the haunted knowledge of her own approaching absence. In the kitchen, I stood on tiptoe to reach the highest cabinet, pushing aside stale cereal boxes and dented cans of food we kept for emergencies to retrieve an old Folgers coffee tin with a plastic lid. Inside was my secret insurance policy, 237 in carefully folded bills, accumulated $1 at a time over months of quiet sacrifice. $1 from finding a more affordable laundry detergent. $2 saved by walking instead of taking the bus when weather permitted. $5 from skipping lunch 3 days in a row. Emergency money that represented countless small deprivations, a habit my mother had instilled in me when I was barely old enough to understand the concept of currency. Always have escape money, Rosa, she'd told me solemnly when I was 7 years old, showing me the hollowed-out book where she kept her own secret fund. A woman without options is a woman in chains. Men come and go, jobs disappear, landlords change their minds, but if you have enough to get yourself to safety, you can survive anything. I slipped the money into my inner jacket pocket, zipped it securely, and pressed my hand against it like a talisman. I never thought the emergency I'd be escaping would be this one, never imagined that the threat would come not from economic hardship or medical catastrophe, but from the two people I had trusted most in the world. With deliberate precision, I placed my keys on the kitchen counter next to the half-empty bottle of mid-price Merlot they must have shared before moving to the bedroom, the same wine Daniel had given me on our first anniversary with such ceremony, as if it were vintage champagne instead of a 14 bottle from the grocery store. The keys made a final metallic sound against the laminate countertop, the harsh fluorescent kitchen light reflecting off the small rainbow unicorn keychain Jennifer had given me last Christmas, now transformed from trinket of friendship to mockery. I looked around one last time at what had been my home for 3 years, the mismatched furniture we'd collected piece by piece, the wall where I'd carefully hung photos of happier times, the small potted plants I'd nurtured on the windowsill despite the limited sunlight, the kitchen table where I'd stayed up late studying for classes I hoped would eventually lead to a better life. Every object, every surface, every memory now contaminated beyond redemption. 3 years of my life. 3 years of sacrifices and compromises and dreams. 3 years of believing I was building something lasting. 3 years of thinking I mattered to someone. All of it dismissed, negated, rendered meaningless with the quiet click of the door locking automatically behind me as I stepped into the hallway, leaving behind not just an apartment, but the person I had been and the future I had planned. Outside, the night had grown colder, or perhaps it was just the sudden absence of the warmth I'd associated with home. I walked without direction at first, the duffel bag growing heavier with each block. Where does one go when home is no longer an option? My mother was gone. My closest friend was currently in bed with my boyfriend. My meager savings wouldn't stretch to a security deposit on a new apartment, even if I could find one willing to rent to me without proof of stable housing. The irony wasn't lost on me. Hours earlier, I'd been pushed aside by a woman who saw me as nothing, and now I truly was nothing, homeless, betrayed, alone. The cheap motel on Riverside Drive was a last resort, its neon vacancy sign buzzing in the darkness like a warning. The night clerk barely looked up from his phone as I paid cash for one night, $59 plus tax, leaving me with less than $170 to my name. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale cigarettes despite the no smoking sign prominently displayed on the peeling wallpaper. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern, worn thin in places, and I didn't dare look too closely at the carpet beneath my feet. The bathroom light flickered ominously, casting jaundiced shadows across the cracked tile floor. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that vaguely resembled a map of Florida, and did the math. At $59 a night, I had exactly 3 nights of shelter before I'd be completely broke. 3 nights to figure out how to rebuild a life that had disintegrated in the space of a few hours. My phone buzzed incessantly as I plugged it in to charge. 14 missed calls from Jen, 2 from Daniel. A text message from Jen that I opened despite myself. "Let me explain, please. It's not what you think." I almost laughed. Not what I think? What else could it be? What innocent explanation could there possibly be for finding my best friend and my boyfriend tangled together in my bed? Another text came through as I watched. "Where are you? Are you safe? Please answer." The concern seemed obscene after what she'd done, as if she had any right to worry about me now after destroying the fragile security I'd built for myself. I turned off my phone and lay back on the bed, not bothering to undress or pull back the covers. The ceiling fan rotated lazily overhead, its rhythmic squeak matching the pulse of blood in my temples. I was too drained to cry, too numb to feel the full weight of my new reality. As I drifted into an uneasy sleep, all I could hear was Victoria's voice echoing in my head. "You shouldn't be seen around people like us." The cruelest part was that she was right. I wasn't meant to be seen, not by the wealthy patrons whose messes I cleaned, not by the boyfriend who had shared my bed for 3 years, not by the friend who knew my deepest fears and used them against me. I was invisible, and perhaps that was safer than the alternative. Morning brought no relief, just harsh sunlight filtering through thin curtains and the distant sound of traffic as the city woke around me. For a disorienting moment, I reached for Daniel beside me, my body operating on the muscle memory of 3 years. The empty space where he should have been served as a stark reminder everything had changed. I showered mechanically, wincing as the water alternated between scalding and freezing with no warning. The complimentary soap was harsh against my skin, but I scrubbed anyway, as if I could wash away the image of Jen and Daniel together, as if cleanliness could somehow restore dignity. The mirror above the sink was spotted with age, distorting my reflection into something almost unrecognizable. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, and my damp hair hung limp around a face that looked suddenly older than my 27 years. I hadn't brought makeup in my hasty packing. What was the point? Who was there to impress? My uniform for Chez Pierre was still in the duffel bag, wrinkled but wearable. The thought of returning there, of facing Marco and the other staff with the knowledge that my entire life had imploded while they went about their routines, made my stomach clench. But what choice did I have? Principals wouldn't pay for another night in this motel, wouldn't put food in my mouth or a roof over my head. I turned my phone back on, bracing for the inevitable barrage of notifications. 23 missed calls, now 18 from Jen, 5 from Daniel, a voicemail from Daniel that I deleted without listening to. What could he possibly say that would matter? A text from my supervisor at the restaurant. Rosa, you're on schedule today, 2:10. Please confirm. Reality settled over me like a shroud. I needed that job, needed those hours. But Jen had gotten me the position through her cousin who worked in management. How could I return there now, knowing that everyone would eventually learn what had happened? The pity would be unbearable, worse, the judgment. People always found a way to blame the woman who wasn't enough to keep her man, even when she was the one betrayed. I typed a response with shaking fingers. I quit. 2 words. Simple, final, devastating. My thumb hovered over the send button for a long moment before pressing down, sealing my fate. There. One more bridge burned, one more tether to my old life severed. I spent the morning at the public library using their computers to search for jobs and housing options. The employment listings were depressingly familiar service industry positions paying minimum wage, requiring experience I didn't have or hours I couldn't work. Housing was worse than nothing available in my price range that wasn't in a neighborhood where safety was a luxury I couldn't afford. By afternoon, desperation had begun to set in. I had 2 more nights paid at the motel, and then what? Shelters were overcrowded with waiting lists weeks long. I had no car to sleep in, no family to take me in, no friends I could trust, not anymore. I walked until my feet ached, applying for jobs at every restaurant, shop, and convenience store that didn't explicitly have a no hiring sign in the window. Most managers barely glanced at my hastily written resume before promising to keep it on file, the polite fiction of the service industry where applications disappeared into drawers never to be seen again. By evening, I'd secured exactly 0 job prospects and eaten nothing but a stale bagel from a coffee shop that offered free refills, letting me nurse a single cup for hours while I gathered my thoughts. My phone buzzed again, Jen, again. This time I answered. Rosa! Thank God, she breathed, her voice cracking with what sounded like genuine relief. I've been so worried. Where are you? Why? The word came out harsher than I intended, stripped of all pretense. Because I care about you, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. As if I'd caught her borrowing a sweater without asking, not sleeping with the man I loved. That's an interesting way to show it. Silence stretched between us, filled with 3 years of shared history and 1 moment of unforgivable betrayal. It was a mistake, she finally said, her voice small. A terrible, horrible mistake. We were drinking and talking about you, and then somehow... Talking about me? I laughed, a hollow sound that surprised even me. What, complaining about what a fool I am? Planning how to break the news that the 2 people I trusted most have been lying to my face? No, Rosa, it wasn't like that. It was just the one time, I swear. Daniel loves you, he's devastated. Stop. My voice was steady now, calmer than I felt. I don't want to hear it. Not now, maybe not ever. Please, Rosa, she begged, and I could hear tears in her voice. Let me make this right. Come stay with me while you figure things out. You shouldn't be alone right now. The audacity was breathtaking. Stay with you? In your apartment, where Daniel is probably waiting right now? Are you insane? He's not here, she protested. I kicked him out this morning. I told him what we did was unforgivable. Rosa, please. You're my best friend. I corrected her. I was your best friend. Now I'm nothing to you, nothing to anyone. Victoria's words echoed in my mind again. A cruel prophecy fulfilled. That's not true, Jen insisted. You're everything to me. You're my sister, my family. I made a terrible mistake, but I love you. Please don't throw away 15 years of friendship over one awful night. For a moment, just a moment, I wavered. 15 years was a long time. We'd survived high school together, held each other through first heartbreaks, celebrated every small victory, and mourned every defeat side by side. She'd been the one constant in a life marked by instability. But then I remembered her face last night, her eyes meeting mine over Daniel's shoulder. She hadn't stopped, hadn't called out, hadn't done anything to preserve the friendship she now claimed was so valuable. Goodbye, Jennifer, I said quietly, and ended the call. I returned to the motel as the sun was setting, the weight of the day pressing down on my shoulders. One day gone, no closer to a solution. Tomorrow would be more of the same, more applications, more rejection, more desperate calculations of dwindling resources. Whispered, "Stay invisible." I woke gasping, sheets tangled around my legs, the cheap motel clock blinking 3:17 a.m. in angry red digits. Sleep didn't return. By the second day, desperation had taken on a sharper edge. I'd applied at 17 more businesses, from fast food restaurants to gas stations, with no immediate prospects. My phone remained silent. I'd blocked both Jen and Daniel's numbers, unwilling to subject myself to more hollow apologies or explanations. I spent hours at the community center, using their bulletin board to look for roommate situations, informal work opportunities, anything that might extend my rapidly dwindling funds. A handwritten note caught my eye. Room for rent, $300 month, females only, must be quiet and clean. It was more than I could afford at the moment, but I copied down the number anyway. Perhaps whoever was offering could wait a week for payment, once I secured some kind of income. The woman who answered sounded elderly, her voice quavering as she explained that yes, the room was still available in her home in the Westridge neighborhood. I need someone who doesn't party. She emphasized, someone responsible. I'm not looking for a caretaker, just a quiet presence in the house and a little extra income. We arranged to meet the following afternoon. One more night in the motel, and then perhaps if luck was finally on my side, I'd have somewhere to go. That evening, I splurged on a proper meal, $8.99 for a dinner special at the diner across from the motel. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a kind smile, brought me extra bread when she noticed me carefully wrapping half my meal to save for breakfast. Rough patch, honey? She asked, refilling my water glass without being asked. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without breaking down. It was the first genuine kindness. Mrs. Abernathy needs her medication at exactly 2 p.m., and don't let her convince you she's already taken it, instructed Nurse Patel at Green Oaks Senior Care Facility. Mr. Chen needs help with his physical therapy exercises, and Mr. Lancaster, well, he's a bit of a challenge. This wasn't exactly how I'd imagined my life would turn out, but 6 months after becoming homeless, I was grateful for the live-in caregiver position. The small room they provided behind the kitchen wasn't much, but it was clean and safe. The work was exhausting, changing adult diapers, bathing elderly residents, administering medications, but it restored something I'd lost: purpose. Lancaster is asking for you again, sighed Nurse Patel one evening. He won't let anyone else help him to bed. William Lancaster was indeed challenging. At 82, the former business mogul had built a regional empire of hardware stores across 3 states before a series of strokes left him partially paralyzed and estranged from his family. He was notorious among the staff for his sharp tongue and impossible standards. Yet somehow, we developed an unlikely bond. Maybe it was because I didn't pity him. Maybe it was because I knew what it felt like to be invisible. "Did you always work in places like this?" he asked me one evening as I helped him with his dinner. "No," I replied, cutting his meat into manageable pieces. "I used to clean bathrooms at a fancy restaurant." He snorted. "People treat you like furniture in places like that." I looked up, surprised by his insight. "Yes, they do." Over the following weeks, Mr. Lancaster began sharing stories about his life, his humble beginnings, how he built his business, his regrets about prioritizing work over family. In return, I found myself telling him things I'd never told anyone, not even Daniel or Jen. About my mother's struggle with addiction, about my dreams of someday starting my own business, about the woman in the bathroom who pushed me aside. "People who have never struggled," he said one evening, "often lack the capacity for genuine compassion. Remember that." 3 months later, Mr. Lancaster suffered another stroke. I sat by his bed in the hospital holding his weathered hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. "Rosa," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "My son." Tried to call him, he never. "Save your strength," I urged, adjusting his oxygen tube. "Listen," he insisted, gripping my hand with surprising strength. Envelope, my room, nightstand drawer. Mr. Lancaster passed away the following morning. His son arrived too late, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the now empty hospital room, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light. Were you with him?" he asked me, his voice breaking. "Yes," I answered simply. "He wasn't alone." The man Michael Lancaster broke down then, shoulders heaving with silent sobs. I stood there uncertainly, this stranger's grief filling the space between us. Later that week, I found the envelope Mr. Lancaster had mentioned. Inside was a handwritten letter, a set of keys and legal documents naming me as the beneficiary of his modest savings and his house in Oakwood Heights. "Rosa," the letter read, "I've lived surrounded by people with money but empty hearts. You're worth your weight in gold. Take what I've left you and build something meaningful. And if you ever meet my son Michael, tell him I forgave him long ago. William." The inheritance wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than I'd ever seen, $187,000 in savings and a mortgage-free house that needed some work but was in a decent neighborhood. I sat on the floor of Mr. Lancaster's roomy room now, I supposed, and wept. 6 months later, Second Chances Apparel opened its doors in a small storefront downtown. I'd used part of the inheritance to start a clothing business that employed women from local shelters, teaching them tailoring and business skills while creating sustainable fashion from upcycled materials. The business grew steadily. A feature in the local newspaper led to an interview on a regional morning show, which caught the attention of a women's business network. 18 months after opening, I was invited to speak at their annual conference about sustainable business practices and second chance employment. I was reviewing my notes backstage when I saw her. Time seemed to slow down as I watched her move through the crowd, less confident than I remembered. Her clothes still expensive, but not ostentatious. She was speaking to the event coordinator, gesturing animatedly. My heart hammered in my chest as I approached them. "Rosa, there you are," the coordinator exclaimed. "This is Victoria Mercer. She's interested in our mentorship program." Victoria's smile froze as she looked at me, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "Have we met before?" she asked, her head tilting slightly. I studied her face, the perfect makeup not quite hiding the fine lines of stress around her eyes. "Perhaps," I said neutrally. After my speech, which received a standing ovation, Victoria approached me again, this time alone. "I didn't recognize you at first," she said, "but during your speech, when you mentioned working in service jobs, it clicked. You're the girl from the bathroom at Chez Pierre, aren't you? The question hung in the air between us. I could have denied it, could have pretended not to know what she was talking about. Instead, I nodded. Yes, and you were the woman who pushed me aside and said I shouldn't be seen around people like you. Victoria's perfectly composed face crumbled. I've lost everything since then, she whispered. My husband left me for his assistant. The prenup was ironclad. I'm starting over. I said nothing, waiting. I'm sorry, she continued, her voice breaking. What I said to you, it was unforgivable. I was cruel and elitist, and I was wrong. I studied her face, searching for insincerity, but finding only raw desperation. Why are you here? I asked finally. I need a job, she admitted. Any job. The coordinator mentioned your company works with women in transition. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who once pushed me aside was now standing before me, begging for help. I could have sent her away with a taste of her own medicine. I could have humiliated her as she had humiliated me. Instead, I handed her my business card. Come by the office tomorrow, 9 a.m. We'll see what skills you have. Her eyes widened in disbelief. After what I did to you, why would you help me? I thought about Mr. Lancaster, about the lessons life had taught me, about the person I wanted to be. Because everyone deserves a second chance, I said simply. Even people like you. As Victoria walked away, clutching my card like a lifeline, a familiar figure approached from the side of the room. Impressive speech, said Michael Lancaster, his father's eyes looking back at me from a younger face. Dad would have been proud. Mr. Lancaster, I said, surprised. I didn't know you'd be here. Michael, please, he corrected with a small smile. And I wouldn't have missed it. When I read about your company in the business journal, I recognized the name. Second chances was what my father always said he wished he'd had with me. We stood in awkward silence for a moment before he continued. I never got to thank you properly for being there for him when I wasn't, for telling me what his last words were. He loved you, I said. He understood more than you might think. Michael nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. I'd like to hear more about his final days if you wouldn't mind sharing over dinner sometime. The invitation caught me off guard. I'd like that, I found myself saying. As I drove home that evening to the house that William Lancaster had left me a house, I transformed from a lonely old man's final residence into a warm home filled with thrift store treasures and handmade curtains, I thought. About the strange turns life takes. From cleaning bathrooms to owning a business. From being pushed aside to extending a hand. From homelessness to creating homes for others. The next morning, Victoria arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, her hands nervously clutching her resume. As I showed her around the workshop where women from all walks of life were cutting patterns, sewing garments, and packing orders, I caught sight of myself in the large mirror that dominated one wall. I no longer looked invisible. I looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. Thank you for this opportunity, Rosa, Victoria said quietly as the tour ended. I won't let you down. Everyone starts somewhere, I replied, even people like us. 3 months later, Michael Lancaster became my business partner, his retail expertise helping to expand Second Chances into 3 more locations. 6 months after that, he became something more. Not a replacement for what I'd lost, but something entirely new, a relationship built on mutual respect and shared values. Sometimes, as I fall asleep beside him in the bed we now share, I think about that night in the cheap motel staring at the water stain on the ceiling, believing my life was over. I think about the woman I was then and the woman I am now. I am no longer invisible. I am seen, I am heard, and most importantly, I see others, especially those society would prefer to ignore. And in that seeing, in that recognition of our common humanity, I found my power.